Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. In general, I try to build my episodes around a bunch of different sources, and I try to keep them focused more on my own research rather than just summarizing or paraphrasing a book. But I just read a book that was so good and that gave me so much to think about and talk about that I just want to focus on that this time. What is this book, you ask? I just read Consorting with Spirits, Your Guide to Working with Invisible Allies by Jason Miller, which came out last year. And like I said, I liked it so much that I want to spend a whole episode talking about it, but also because this is actually going to be 2 episodes. Jason Miller has written a bunch of books about magic and that sort of thing, but this is the first of his books that I've read, and I'm definitely going to pick up the rest of his books because I think there will be a lot of relevant stuff there. But this book, Consorting with Spirits, is geared toward magical practitioners, but as I was reading, I found that it has a ton of great info for people more like me who are interested in paranormal investigation but aren't necessarily doing a lot of magic or don't identify that way. So in this episode, I want to touch on the aspects of the book that felt most relevant to ghost hunting. Like I said, my thoughts and notes from this book are going to be split into 2 different episodes. So in this one, I want to focus on doubt, psychic abilities, discernment, and things like that. There was a lot of really great stuff in the book that addressed something that I think about all the time, which is doubting yourself, doubting your own paranormal experiences, and your own experiences in general, and kind of trying to figure out what just happened when something unusual happens, and sort of how to look at an experience and analyze it. So in the next episode, I want to hone in more on specific topics and concepts that the book goes over, including communicating with local and nature spirits, interacting with cryptids, because he recounts some totally fascinating communications that he has had with the Jersey Devil, which was just so cool. Honestly, I think it's worth reading the book just for those bits in the book, though of course there's a lot of other cool stuff in there. And also there's stuff like ley lines and that sort of thing. So that's going to be next time. Like I said earlier, there's plenty of information about what I would describe as ceremonial magic in the book, including specific invocations and prayers addressed to specific named spirits or deities. I'm not experienced in magic. That's not a huge focus of mine. So I'm not going to touch on those aspects of the book much at all. But I wanted to make sure to mention that the book has that information. And I guess as sort of a disclaimer, I read the book through the lens of a paranormal researcher and investigator, so I've gathered and synthesized my notes and thoughts about the book in that spirit. I'm basically trying to present the things that I found most interesting and helpful in my look at the paranormal, and I'm kind of trying to repackage them in a way that would make it helpful for my listeners, for you, as you think and interact with the paranormal. Now, like I said, Miller approaches all of this from a magical perspective, which differs a bit from the perspective that I am using. So it's very possible that he might disagree with some of my conclusions or applications of these concepts as I tie them into ghost hunting. And he is very direct in saying that the book, Consorting with Spirits, should not be a person's first book about magic. I haven't included specific prayers or conjuring techniques in this episode or the next one because, 1, they're a bit over my head, and also because that just seems irresponsible. But if you want the full picture and all of the info in the book, of course, just pick up the book. Like I said, I really loved it. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is, in the book, Miller talks a lot about ways to improve paranormal experiences. He has really valuable insights about how to have better and more effective interactions with the paranormal. And he might not be using those terms. He talks a lot more in terms of spirits and deities and that sort of thing. But, that is also the paranormal. So there's a great Q&A in the back of the book, and he asked his many students and former students for questions about communicating with spirits and interacting with spirits. and someone asked him how to become better at seeing spirits. So I'd like to just start out with what he said is helpful. First, you should avoid doubt. He says that you should only debunk yourself or try to debunk yourself in your experiences after the experience has already occurred and it's over. If you try to question something while it is happening, you'll stop it from happening. And he says that that's because when you start to debunk things, you're turning off the parts of your brain that allow you to experience the unusual thing that is occurring. So it literally kind of like changes your perception. And like I said, I'm very interested in this concept of doubt and the paranormal, and I am going to loop back to this. So another thing that he said is important is to meditate and try to learn to sit still. You need to be able to listen and to do nothing and to kind of just be able to receive information and observe things. And again, I'll talk more about meditation later. So this next one I thought was really interesting. He says that it's important to look at the ways in which your senses and awareness of your physical environment work with your mind. Basically, he talks about how your eyes see things, but your brain is what adapts them and turns them into experiences that mean something. He says that the trick is to look at that and then trace that process backwards in order to perceive new things via other types of input, like, psychic input, different types of perception, etc. I think that's a really interesting concept, and I'm still kind of turning over in my mind what that means, but it seems like a cool and interesting exercise to sort of see what you're observing visually or, auditorily or tactilely and trace that back into your brain and see the ways in which you construct meaning and how that changes your perception. That's very cool. So then the fourth thing that he mentions is he talks about a inner heat practice that he goes into depth on in the book Sex, Sorcery, and Spirit. I haven't read this book yet, so I can't really say much about it, but I wanted to mention it because it felt relevant. If that's something you're interested in, check that book out. He says that the practice is hard, but not too hard, but it has a big payoff. So if that's interesting to you, check out Sex, Sorcery, and Spirit. So another interesting thing that he talks about is the idea of psychic ability and sort of natural psychic ability, or how some people have many psychic experiences very easily while other people have very few. And this is very interesting to me because I definitely consider myself not sensitive. You know how it feels like everybody nowadays identifies as an empath? And I'm not saying that a lot of people aren't empaths, but that's a big topic, I feel like, nowadays. And I feel like I'm whatever the opposite of an empath is. I'm very oblivious. It takes a lot to get my attention. So I definitely fall into the category of people who just don't have as many natural, psychic experiences. And he has this great quote in the book where he says, "Some people get into magic so they can experience spirits speaking to them, and others get into magic because they need to make the spirits shut up." So I'm definitely in that former category. I'm always looking for a conversation with spirits and often not finding one, right? And I feel like in the paranormal, there is a lot of focus on people with natural psychic ability or mediumistic ability, sensitive people, empaths, and again, not trying to say anything bad about anyone with natural abilities, but as someone with no natural or effortless ability, I was kind of interested in his take on how having lots of psychic experiences isn't always a good thing. And it can really lead you astray in magic and, obviously in paranormal investigation as well. So to read from the book, if you close your eyes and see pictures or hear voices after every invocation, then you're getting a lot of fairly meaningless surface level communication. What you need is a way to separate out the signal from the noise. And to do this, he says that you need to develop your perception-projection ratio. So what is that? The perception-projection ratio is the split between your own perception of what really happened versus the meaning you project onto it. So kind of looping back to one of those core points of advice that I went through earlier. And, kind of this idea that you perceive something, say you see it with your eyes, but then your brain projects and puts all this stuff on there and constructs meaning there. And projection happens in both mundane life and when having paranormal experiences, of course. There have been plenty of studies about how different people perceive the same things very differently, like remembering conversations and events in wildly divergent ways. And to quote him, "If our perceptions of ordinary conversations and events are subject to this much distortion, how much more so are our spiritual experiences that are, by definition, even more subtle?" So he says, to help balance your perception-projection ratio, ask yourself these two questions. 1, is this information actionable? And 2, is this information useful? Right? So say you've had some sort of interaction with something paranormal, you've received some information, and now you can just put it through this filter, right? Is it actionable? Is it useful? And even if the answer is no to both of them, it doesn't mean that you're imagining a paranormal experience. He says that the questions are just a tool to balance yourself, and it's important to keep these questions in mind, especially because it can help prevent self-aggrandizement and it helps people stay humble about their own spirit communications. And he kind of alludes to the idea of how there are some people in spiritual spaces who can become very invested in their own abilities and their own ego. So I think it's cool that he has this sort of counter for that, or way to hopefully prevent that sort of thing. And I also like that it's a bit of a rubric for analyzing and thinking through paranormal experiences. And in addition to the questions about actionability and usefulness that he suggests using, he also includes other helpful criteria for critically examining paranormal experiences. Here's what he says in the book. After the communication is over, now it's time to be critical about your experience. I mean really ruthless. Put your experience through a checklist. Was there anything actionable that I got out of this? Does taking those actions make sense, or at least cause no harm? Did I learn anything verifiable? Was the spirit or vision something that strokes my ego, or was it challenging? And I think that's a checklist that would be useful in any ghost hunter's toolbox, for sure. Oh, and by the way, I have on BuriedSecretsPodcast.com, I have the show notes for this episode, so I include all of these questions, all of this info in the script for this episode. So if you're someone who is not taking notes during a podcast while listening to a podcast, I don't know why you would be doing that, since most people multitask. You can always check my website after this and get this info and make it into a checklist for yourself. So that's on BuriedSecretsPodcast.com. So then another thing that he says is very helpful in your toolbox for communicating with spirits is meditation and also just idleness. He talks about how having moments where you're meditating and just also moments where you're being idle is critical to seeing spirits. He differentiates the two of them by saying that meditation is when you are focused on a single thing. Maybe it's your breath, maybe it's a mantra, something like that. Whereas idleness, on the other hand, isn't focus. It's more like a lack of focus. It might look like going for a walk or doing a repetitive task because your brain needs to be able to play and have this unstructured time for creativity, etc. So to read from the book, leaving the mind unoccupied allows for windows of clarity to appear amidst the normal patterns of thoughts and attachments. Your idle time will cultivate your ability to open the senses, and it gives spirits the room to communicate with you. Your meditation time will give you the tool to go back over what you receive and separate out real communication from fantasy. So this makes a lot of sense to me, and it's also really interesting to me because there's been so much great conversation lately about the idea of laziness, and basically how that's just a concept that is meant to make people feel like they need to work constantly and like they need to feel guilty anytime they're not being productive. The book Laziness Does Not Exist by Dr. Devin Price is all about the subject. It's an excellent read, especially if you have trouble letting yourself relax and just letting yourself do nothing. So if you struggle with this idleness, pick up Laziness Does Not Exist. It's really good. The audiobook is really good. That's how I read it. And I just want to linger a little bit on this idea of laziness and idleness. because I have a hunch that out of all the really great advice that is given in this book and all of the notes that I've synthesized here, I kind of feel like the idea of giving yourself time to be idle and do nothing might be the most difficult concept and like the most difficult thing for people to put into practice, because we have been so conditioned that like you always need to be going, going, going. It's wrong to stop. It's wrong to relax. And that just couldn't be further from the truth. So Dr. Devin Price, the author of Laziness Does Not Exist, talked to NPR about his book in 2021, and I wanted to read a little bit of that article to give you a bit of a taste of Price's argument. So, reading from that article, a surprising influence helped author Devin Price understand what can be harmful about closely associating our worth with our work. His pet chinchilla dump truck. He's never been productive in his life, Price says. The social psychologist and author of Laziness Does Not Exist says dump truck is pretty much the opposite of productive and frankly, rather destructive. I would never look at him and think of his life in terms of has he justified his right to exist. He is not paying rent, he is not performing any service, and it would be absurd to even think about his life in those terms, he says. I think animals help us remember that we shouldn't have to earn our right to exist. We're fine and beautiful and completely lovable when we're just sitting on the couch, just breathing. And if we can feel that way about animals that we love and about, relatives that we love, people in our lives who we never judged by their productive capacity, then we can start thinking of ourselves that way too. I think it can be really difficult to allow yourself to just relax and do nothing. And as for me, I have definitely burned myself out again and again through school and different jobs because I haven't given myself enough time to just do nothing. And as I've gotten older, I notice that I personally need a lot of idle time, not just so I can access paranormal experiences and greater creativity. I just need slack time to exist at all as a functional human. I spend a lot of time playing solitaire, drawing, going for long walks, staring into space. And if I don't get that alone time, and not just alone time, but like time not doing something useful, then my brain just kind of shuts down. I can't do anything. And I also have talked about this on the podcast before, but I need that decompression time when I've been overstimulated, which I talked about in my sleep paralysis in Scranton episode. And I don't think I'm alone in this. I think that everybody, to different extents, needs that idle time. In the NPR article, Price says, laziness is usually a warning sign from our bodies and our minds that something is not working. The human body is so incredible at signaling when it needs something. But we have all learned to ignore those signals as much as possible because they're a threat to our productivity and our focus at work. So all of this is to say, there are many reasons why humans need idleness, both for mundane reasons and also in order to better perceive and interact with the paranormal. So if that's something you struggle with, check out Laziness Does Not Exist by Dr. Devin Price. And also, if you are neurodivergent or you think you might be neurodivergent or someone you know is neurodivergent, I really recommend that you pick up the book Unmasking Autism by Dr. Devin Price, because that book really goes into the needs of neurodivergent people, and it interviews a ton of neurodivergent people. And again, people have talked about how they have completely burned themselves out. They take a long time to recover from that. And they kind of talk about their techniques for recovery. And so much of that is just like getting the chance to focus on things you're interested in and also getting the chance to do nothing. So whether or not you're autistic, that book also talks a lot about ADHD, but I kind of get the sense that a lot of people who are into the paranormal are neurodivergent in some way. So I wanted to make sure to mention that book as well. That's Unmasking Autism. Check it out, it's really good. Oh, and there's one more thing I wanted to say about kind of the links between idleness and meditation and perception. In that Dr. Devin Price quote that I read, there's that line, that says the human body is so incredible at signaling when it needs something, but we've all learned to ignore those signals as much as possible because they're a threat to our productivity and our focus at work. And that line to me really meshes well with a lot of the message in Consorting with Spirits about the need for meditation and idleness, because so much of it is about learning the landscape of your own brain and your own mind, and learning how to discern, what is you, what is a spirit, kind of what are the borders of your perception and like the venues or avenues of your perception. And Miller talks about how meditation is a really great way to just get to know your brain and become familiar with that. And when Dr. Devon Price talks about the signals that our body gives us to tell us that we need to chill and take it easy and slow down, it just really makes me think about the things that Miller says about meditation. So what I'm trying to say here is it's fascinating how much the work of someone who is very into magic and spirituality and that sort of thing dovetails with the work of a social psychologist who is an expert on and is writing about the need for rest and laziness in our society, and the need for understanding neurodivergence and ensuring that society accommodates neurodivergence, etc. It's just interesting to me how much it dovetails, because I think that so often it feels like magical things and paranormal things are kind of in their own zone, and, mass market popular books about psychology, like social psychology, are in a totally other zone, like kind of like airport books versus books that you'll find in a metaphysical store. But it's all connected. So anyway, to step off my soapbox about laziness and idleness, and to get back to talking about the lessons from Consorting with Spirits, one thing that Miller says in the book is that it is important to not be afraid to try new things and practice communicating with spirits, even if you kind of don't feel ready for it or don't feel like an expert. And he says, naturally any action is a risk, but also not acting is a risk. And you'll never learn everything by just reading books. You have to learn things by doing. And he has this great line in the book, which is prepare less, risk more. You will get further. And I personally felt called out by this. I'm someone who will completely submerge themselves in research and reading, and I have a terrible track record of prioritizing those things over actually actively seeking out paranormal experiences, which is why so many paranormal stories that I have are about places I've lived, places I've stayed, and that sort of thing. I, of course, have done some paranormal investigations, but so much more often I feel like the paranormal finds me versus the other way around, because I end up being scared of doing something wrong, or I kind of had that attitude where I'm like, I'll do this thing as soon as I'm done researching. I'll do this thing as soon as I'm done reading these books. I definitely have that perfectionist mindset, which is very harmful, and I am sure that I'm not the only one. So this is a helpful call out, I think, for me at least. And I think for me, my fear isn't like about the paranormal. Like, I don't think for the most part that I am scared of something paranormal and bad happening to me. If you've listened way back in the catalog of episodes, at some point in the series on Ouija boards that I did, I was talking to my co-host at the time, my friend Jen, and I was telling her about this uncomfortable experience that I had using a planchette, like an automatic writing planchette, in my apartment, and it really freaked me out, and I was scared by that. And then, of course, if you listen to an episode like my sleep paralysis in Scranton episode, that was another moment where I felt scared by something paranormal. But those moments are really few and far between, and I think for me, my sense of doubt and unwillingness to just kind of dive in and get my hands dirty comes more from my perfectionist tendencies than from any fear that something bad is going to happen to me. But I am going to try to keep that line in my head, prepare less, risk more, to try to counteract my perfectionist tendencies. But if you are someone who tends to not want to engage with the paranormal because of fear, Miller has some really great specific advice on how to try to avoid that fear. So the first thing he says is that you should consume less scary media. That means watching fewer horror movies and basically avoiding narratives that have been crafted to make you feel fear when it comes to the paranormal. He points out that so many people have enough faith in their magical abilities that they think that they can make something really scary happen, like summon something or cause something to happen, and it's really scary, but they don't have enough faith in themselves to think that they can fix matters if they go sideways. And that's kind of illogical, because if you are like powerful enough or connected or tapped in enough to something for something bad to happen, kind of the other side of that coin seems like it should be that you also have the ability to help yourself and do some damage control, etc. And that fear comes from horror movies. And I think this is amazing advice. I totally agree with it. I can't remember if I've talked about it on the podcast, but I've definitely talked about it on other people's podcasts. But I hate horror movies. I've watched almost none of them. Like, I like The Shining, but that's more like a psychological thriller. I generally just feel like they're manipulative. I don't like jump scares. And I feel like they're just creating fear. And I don't feel exhilaration when I feel fear. I just feel uncomfortable. So I really don't like horror movies. But I think it totally makes sense that so many people are influenced by this. And, you know, there have been things like The Exorcist, which involves becoming possessed because of Ouija board use. And then now all these people are so scared of Ouija boards. And it does kind of feel like horror movies can shape mass hysteria, or at least popular perceptions of what the paranormal is and how dangerous it is. And like, the truth of the matter is, like, you can't have a good story without dramatic things happening. So if we're talking about a horror movie or a horror book or whatever, or a video game, there has to be a ton of scary stuff happening. Otherwise, why on earth would you watch it? And I would also argue that the same kind of goes with some paranormal TV shows, like some of the big ones by the big networks. I have not watched a ton of them, but some of the stuff that I have watched, I've noticed some like really extreme reactions to things. And I don't really blame people for that. It's an entertainment product. You want people to stay on that channel, so they watch the advertisements and networks make money. But again, that's like not realistic. So if you're feeling afraid of paranormal things, even though you want to have experiences with them, just don't watch so many horror movies. Great advice. So then Miller also says that, you know, if you're feeling a lot of fear when it comes to interacting with the paranormal, try to focus on the excitement that underlies your fear and kind of try to look past the fear. And that's one trick you can use to help yourself there. He also says you can practice the stoic exercise, which is where you look at the worst case scenario of what might happen if you do the thing you're afraid of. Then you turn it around and you look at the things you might lose if you don't do the thing you're afraid of. And I think that is amazing advice as well. And another reason why he says it's important to practice magic often, or, you know, for our purposes, interact with the paranormal often, is because there are seldom massive, intense paranormal experiences that leave no room for doubt. Again, life is not a paranormal TV show. It's not being edited by somebody. And, you know, there's not a narrative being constructed there by anyone aside from yourself, I guess. So a bunch of little things will happen. And we become convinced of the reality of the paranormal through that series of small, unexplainable events that, when taken all together, leave very little room for doubt, but when looked at individually, can always be debunked, right? And I've talked about this a lot with my own paranormal experiences. Individually, often things don't seem that intense or are just really easily explained away, but the more you zoom out and the more there's a pattern, the more it feels like there's meaning there, and the harder it is to deny the existence of something paranormal. And of course, you're not going to have a bunch of little unexplainable events that then lead you to learn a lot about the paranormal, doubt it less, and kind of have a greater data set to work from. You're not going to have those experiences if you don't try to engage with the paranormal often. So I think that's just great advice. Also, related to fear and the paranormal, Miller says that it's really important to use critical thinking when interacting with paranormal things. Don't do things just because a spirit told you to, or you think a spirit told you to. If a spirit is getting too controlling and unpleasant, then you should just stop working with them. Like, don't feel excessive fear, just treat them like you would a person. And if you're in a scary or unpleasant relationship or friendship or interaction with a person, you would remove yourself from that interaction. So you should do the same with spirits. And he says, you shouldn't let a spirit or another person rule your life. You shouldn't be afraid to tell an entity or a spirit or a psychic or medium or whatever no. And you should use your head and your own discretion during any interaction with spirits. And I think, that TLDR of don't let something else control your life, whether that's your fear or something you think a spirit is telling you or something that someone else says that a spirit is telling you, is just a great thing to keep in mind. So then the next thing I want to talk about is also tied in with, doubt and fear and that sort of thing. And that's the question that you might ask yourself. Am I making this paranormal experience up? Am I talking to a ghost or am I talking to myself? And how do you tell? And Miller says that meditation is the best way to discern what is real spirit communication and what is just a message from your ego. The idea is that meditation allows you to have a better grasp of what your mind looks like and feels like and how it works. So that way it's easier to see what is coming from your brain and what is coming from outside, like I was talking about earlier. Also, like I mentioned earlier, he says, beware of communication that seems to be focused on stroking your ego and making you feel better about yourself, because that communication is more likely to be bogus and might even be delivered by someone who is trying to manipulate you, in the case of human mediums, for example. He also talks about how real entities will tell you no. If you are regularly communicating with a spirit or an entity that has never told you no, then in all likelihood, you're just talking to yourself. And he said that there can be a real danger in believing that you're talking to a actual entity who is endorsing everything that you do, when really you're just talking yourself into following the status quo and believing that nothing in your life needs to change, you're doing everything right, all good. That's how you end up feeling stuck in your life and thinking that you shouldn't try to change or improve things. And as comforting as that might be, you'll never really grow that way. And when interacting with the paranormal, Miller says the most important thing is to, quote, engage the experience without doubt while it is happening, analyze it critically after it is over. So like I alluded to earlier, all of his talk about doubt and just getting out there and doing things both spoke to me and made me feel called out, since that's something I'm trying to work on. But while I was working on this script, I was thinking about the most recent episode before this one, which if you've listened to it, you know what I'm referring to, probably. During a solo paranormal investigation, I distinctly felt a breath on my neck. And during the audio recording that I play in the episode, you can hear me say, it's probably just the wind. But that evening, when I sat down and wrote out my impressions, I very clearly described the feeling as a breath. Because that's what I was feeling in that moment. But while it was happening, I just didn't feel comfortable admitting it out loud. And who knows what might have happened if I had been more willing to admit the reality of paranormal experiences while they're happening. According to Miller, the doubt that I felt might have actually shut down my ability to perceive and interact with the paranormal in those moments. And like I said, for a long time I've been trying to work on doubting my own experience less, just because it's kind of irrational to always deny what I'm experiencing. And sometimes I feel like I'm just gaslighting myself. I'm like, oh, no, there's an explanation for everything. Even if someone else told me the exact same story, I'd be like, oh, it definitely seems like something's up. So for me, this book just gave me another reason to try to avoid doubt in the moment because, yeah, it could compromise my ability to perceive the paranormal. So with all that being said, and in the spirit of, preparing less, risking more, and getting out there and doing more things, I just wanted to share one exercise from the book that I liked. Throughout the book, Miller includes plenty of great actionable things that you can do to try to interact with the paranormal, but this is one that was so simple and easy and that you could try right now while I'm talking or, right after you finish listening to this podcast. So I wanted to share it. So I'm reading from the book now. Step 1, Look straight ahead. It doesn't matter what is in front of you. Anything from a sprawling vista to a wall will do. Just look. Step 2. Now imagine that everything in front of you is actually on a video screen. Pretend it's a two-dimensional representation of what you see. It looks the same, just as it would if you were looking at a high-definition screen that took up your whole view, but you know that it is just a screen. Step 3. Consider what is on the other side of that screen. Listen closely. Reach out with your feelings. Can you sense it? Is there something on the other side? The idea is that this exercise, quote, collapses our normal sensation of 3 dimensions of space down to 2 dimensions, which leaves a mental slot open for us to perceive something we normally don't. Miller does caution that the exercise can make you feel slightly dizzy, nauseous, or panicked, but, I tried it out while I was reading the book on an airplane, and it was very interesting, and I definitely want to continue trying this exercise. And, if you try it and have any interesting thoughts or experiences or reactions, I'm definitely curious to hear them. And you can email me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. So that's everything I wanted to cover this time. Like I said, I don't usually go this in-depth on a book, but this just felt like it had a lot of really unique, valuable information. And like I said, I'm really just scratching the surface here. You should just pick up the book. It's on Scribd, and I think both ebook and audiobook if you use Scribd, which is what I use for most of my reading. But, you should be able to pick it up pretty much anywhere. And like I said, I definitely want to try to read some more of Jason Miller's books. If the others are anything like this one, I think that they'll be really interesting and I will learn a lot. So I'll be back next time with even more takeaways from this book, Consorting with Spirits. But in the meantime, you can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. Oh, I'm also on Mastodon now. If you use Mastodon, you can find me at Buried Secrets Podcast at weirdo.network. So Mastodon users, follow me there. Let's be friends there. You can check out the show notes with the script for this episode, as well as many of my sources at buriedsecretspodcast.com. If you liked this episode, please rate and review it on whatever podcatcher you're using, but especially Apple Podcasts and or Spotify. And please tell your friends about the podcast. I think most people discover podcasts through word of mouth. And thanks so much for listening.